Hello, it's PSYCHOCORE, the silent predator, Jung's warning about ego inflation. There exists a category of individual who transcends mere toxicity or destructiveness. Carl Jung identified them as humanity's most silent and lethal threat, one that might already be walking among us. Perhaps they share your dinner table, or worse, you've welcomed them into your circle of trust without the slightest suspicion. This person appears perfectly normal. They smile genuinely, listen attentively, and make you feel valued, all while secretly constructing a narrative where you're merely a disposable piece in their elaborate game. If you believe I'm being dramatic, consider this unsettling reality. Such individuals don't need to raise their voice or inflict obvious harm. Their weapon is subtlety itself. Their poison comes wrapped in apparent affection. Jung described this as the complete absence of self-reflection combined with unwavering certainty that their worldview represents the only valid truth. He called it a pathology of the spirit, a corruption of awareness that destroys not only its host, but contaminates everything nearby. Have you experienced this phenomenon? Being gradually diminished by someone who makes you question your judgment, your memories, your very emotions? Someone who transforms every disagreement into evidence of your inadequacy, your flawed perception? When you finally attempt to resist, they regard you with that chilling composure that whispers, "Poor soul, they understand nothing." This reveals the true nature of an ego inflated beyond reason. What makes this even more terrifying is how rarely such individuals raise suspicion. The person embodying this dangerous trait might present as your mentor, your closest friend, or your romantic partner. They may shower you with praise and attention while simultaneously planting the notion that without them, you are worthless. The most disturbing aspect is that this mechanism isn't accidental. It's a deliberate pattern. Jung observed that this personality type becomes so consumed by their own mythology of superiority that they completely lose the capacity to view themselves as ordinary human beings. For them, any boundary becomes an insult, any criticism transforms into aggression, and any attempt to treat them as equals feels like blasphemy. While you engage in self-doubt, while you question whether you're being too harsh or too lenient, they never question anything. Never. They exist in a fortress of absolute certainty, convinced that error, guilt, and imperfection always reside in others, never within themselves. As you listen to this, perhaps a specific name or face has emerged in your mind, and you're wondering if you've become the target of this spiritual disease. The answer is likely yes, because eventually we all encounter the inflated individual, the one who never acknowledges mistakes, who converts every conversation into their personal stage where they're perpetually correct. What makes such a person genuinely dangerous is their complete lack of awareness regarding their own toxicity. On the contrary, they believe their presence is a blessing. They're convinced they're educating you, that your resistance stems from ingratitude. This is precisely why the more you attempt to distance yourself, the harder they work to ensnare you in their web of psychological dependency. Make no mistake, this isn't your typical arrogant personality who shouts and makes threats. This is something far more twisted. Jung explained that the inflated ego becomes an independent entity, operating with the coldness of a predator who doesn't recognize their predatory nature. This is what confuses most people. You won't see guilt in their eyes, no remorse, only condescension. If you're thinking you'd never fall into such a trap, allow me to shatter that illusion. We are all vulnerable without exception. These individuals don't advertise their true nature. They arrive disguised as saviors, allies, or mentors. While you lower your defenses, they study your fears, your emptiness, your desperate need for validation. This is how they conquer your will, not through violence, but through the apparent certainty that only they possess the correct answers. Should you dare to doubt, they'll brand you as ungrateful, ignorant, or cowardly. If they don't destroy you through direct confrontation, they'll weaken you with strategic silences and calculated gestures. Jung was explicit. There's no subtler danger than an individual who believes themselves enlightened, who cannot tolerate criticism, and who feeds on others' submission. When your will bends to their narrative, nothing of your authentic self remains. Your identity dissolves. Your confidence becomes a caricature, and your voice transforms into an echo that only repeats what they deem acceptable. I tell you plainly, if you notice someone responding with absolute contempt when you question their ideas, if they never admit fault, if every disagreement ends with them highlighting your shortcomings, walk away. It doesn't matter if they're family, a leader, or a lover. Ego inflation is a bottomless abyss that swallows everything that ventures too close. Perhaps you think I'm exaggerating, that no one could wield such power. But answer this. How many people do you know who live trapped in relationships where they feel diminished daily? How often have you witnessed someone abandon their own clarity to avoid rejection by an insatiable ego? Jung wrote with chilling precision, inflation is always a risk when the individual identifies with something that claims superiority over human nature. This captures the essence of the danger. Such individuals no longer consider themselves part of your species. In their minds, they transcend all judgment. When someone believes they're above moral limitations, their capacity for harm becomes infinite. To protect yourself, engrave this truth in your memory. Regardless of how seductive their certainty appears, how brilliant their rhetoric sounds, or what they promise, if they lack self-criticism, if they believe they're chosen, if they never acknowledge cracks in their narrative, you're facing the most dangerous manifestation Jung studied throughout his career. The ego inflated to madness represents a psychic virus that contaminates everything it touches. Now tell me, how many times have you mistaken this madness for charisma? How often have you called admirable someone who is merely enslaved by their own inflation? How frequently have you applauded poison, convinced it was nourishment? Consider your answer carefully, because tonight when you close your eyes, you might discover you've been living with that monster for years. Or worse still, that monster has begun growing inside you. As you contemplate this uncomfortable question, understand something even more disturbing. The person with the inflated ego doesn't always operate alone. Often this profile finds the perfect environment to expand. The group, the crowd, the circle that out of fear or convenience decides to grant them power without questioning anything. Here emerges another phenomenon Jung analyzed with brutal clarity: psychic contagion. Do you think ego inflation is merely an individual trait? You're mistaken. It's a fire that spreads with terrifying ease. Contagion occurs when a single individual with excessive conviction begins imposing their narrative, and gradually those around them start replicating their beliefs unconsciously. Thus, a mass is born that doesn't think or feel, only obeys. You might consider this exaggerated, something that only happens in cults or extremist groups. But contagion can occur in your family, your workplace, any community where a sufficiently confident voice begins replacing individual thought. Initially, it seems harmless: advice, a firm opinion, a recommendation. Later, that voice becomes the only valid reference. What was once debate becomes dogma. What was once diversity transforms into submission. Jung maintained that the human psyche naturally seeks certainties because uncertainty is unbearable. When someone appears offering definitive answers, most people feel relief. That relief is the hook, because behind that apparent clarity hides a trap: the voluntary surrender of your judgment. The most sinister aspect is that psychic contagion doesn't require explicit coercion. They don't need to shout or threaten. That gentle but constant pressure is sufficient to make you feel that dissent equals betrayal. Thinking differently becomes synonymous with ingratitude, and setting boundaries makes you an enemy. Meanwhile, the inflated ego enjoys contemplating their work. A circle of people who no longer dare challenge them. People who have surrendered their mental autonomy to avoid expulsion from the flock. People who, by repeating the same slogans, end up believing they're their own thoughts. Have you noticed those groups where everyone thinks, speaks, and feels identically? Have you observed how any dissenting voice gets suffocated with a mixture of disdain and pity? That's not unity. That's the corrosive effect of psychic contagion. The multiplication of the inflated ego until it becomes a collective monster. If you think I'm exaggerating, ask yourself why so many intelligent people end up justifying the unjustifiable. Why so many get trapped in dynamics where dissenters are humiliated. The answer is simple. Fear of exclusion. Fear of losing approval from the leader who never errs, who always has brilliant explanations for every mistake. Always outside their own responsibility. Jung warned that collective contagion was even more dangerous than individual inflation because when a single inflated ego convinces dozens of people, the damage amplifies exponentially. The group stops questioning and starts defending the indefensible. It becomes a blind entity protecting the inflated ego, even if that means destroying each member's dignity. But there's something else almost no one tells you. When you enter that circle, you begin distorting your own perception of reality. Your moral compass stops pointing toward truth and starts pointing toward acceptance. You don't ask if something is right, you ask if it's approved by the inflated ego. When you reach that point, your inner freedom ceases to exist. Stop for a moment. Think of all the times you've remained silent from fear of disapproval. All the occasions when you looked away while someone abused their power. Do you really believe you were being prudent? Or were you participating in that silent contagion? The true danger of this sign isn't only that it destroys its embodiment, it transforms others into accomplices. The more people join that complicity, the more untouchable the inflated ego becomes. It surrounds itself with an army of loyalists who will repeat any lie, defend any excess, justify any abuse. I'm going to tell you something you won't like admitting. Perhaps you've also been part of that army. Perhaps at some point you decided it was easier to praise than confront, safer to agree than question. Maybe you applauded someone you knew was wrong simply because it was easier than risking their anger or contempt. But understand this. No group based on ego idolization can survive without paying a price, and that price is always the consciousness of its members. Jung made it clear. The more individuals submit to an authority that admits no criticism, the further they drift from their own soul. When you distance yourself from your soul, everything empties. Psychic contagion is an invisible epidemic you won't see coming because its disguise is perfect. It will make you feel part of something important, convince you that you're on the right side, that your loyalty is virtuous. But behind that facade lies the systematic mutilation of your will. So before continuing to live convinced that the problem exists only in others, ask yourself with brutal honesty, what part of you is willing to sacrifice mental independence for the relief of belonging? How much of your judgment have you traded to avoid loneliness? And what price are you paying to maintain that illusion? Ego inflation isn't just an individual spectacle. It's an epidemic that contaminates entire families, companies, and societies. If you lack the courage to see that truth, one day you'll awaken transformed into one of those loyalists who lose their voice in exchange for protection from a desperate individual disguised as a guide. When that happens, When you look back and discover that all your thinking has been reduced to echoing another's voice, it will be too late. Because freedom of thought doesn't return easily, and consciousness that abdicates before an inflated ego is rarely the same again. While you wonder if all this isn't an exaggeration, I want you to consider something very few have the courage to face directly. What makes the inflated ego and its psychic contagion such a resilient cancer is that they feed on a human need we all secretly share. The need for meaning. The brutal anxiety we feel when we suspect our existence might be irrelevant. That anguish makes many perfect prey because the inflated ego doesn't only offer certainties, it offers a narrative, a story where you occupy a special place as long as you remain obedient. There lies the most brilliant trap. Such individuals make you feel chosen, as if being part of their orbit redeems you from the mediocrity you so fear. If you think this doesn't affect you, let me destroy your illusion. We all carry that fissure inside. Jung called it the shadow, the sum of everything we reject within ourselves. The shadow is the root of self-deception, the hiding place of our guilt and insecurity. The inflated ego detects your shadow like a bloodhound, sensing your weak points, your fears, your desires for approval, and uses them with diabolical skill. That's why when you encounter such a person, your first reaction isn't rejection, but fascination. You're dazzled by their composure, their conviction, their way of stating everything as if it were carved in stone. Without realizing it, you begin surrendering ground. First your doubt, then your voice, finally your identity. All traded for a mirage of meaning. The most chilling aspect is that often the inflated ego doesn't need to manipulate consciously. They don't act like a novel's villain. They simply believe so deeply in their superiority that they don't even consider alternative versions of reality. That blind certainty is what makes their influence so corrosive. While you question whether you're being unfair, they never question anything. Jung said inflation is a psychic possession, a kind of trance. When someone becomes possessed by that absolute conviction that their voice is the only one that matters, what emerges within them is a will to dominate, a hunger to impose their narrative, not only from pride, but because they believe doing so is an act of generosity, as if nullifying you were a service. If you think such people only exist in power spheres, you're mistaken. It could be your boss, your partner, that friend who always offers advice that sounds like divine pronouncement. It could be anyone who has transformed their certainty into an altar. But there's something even more sinister I want you to see clearly. When you relate prolongedly with this profile, your own perception of the world begins distorting. You start doubting your memories, distrusting your emotions, wondering if perhaps your entire life you've been wrong. This phenomenon has a name: induced cognitive dissonance. It's a process where your mind splits in two, one part sensing something doesn't fit, another preferring to believe the inflated ego's version because, although painful, it's simpler. Even though their narrative crushes you, at least it offers a sense of order. Here's where the most dangerous mutation occurs. When the dissonance becomes unbearable, your mind makes an unconscious decision. It abandons its own voice to align with the others. It's a sacrifice of identity in exchange for a little peace, a devastating trade that transforms you into an echo. The worst part is that this sacrifice isn't always obvious. Often it disguises itself as maturity. You begin telling yourself that surrendering your judgment is an act of humility, that accepting another's dominance is a sign of respect. You invent noble arguments to justify your surrender because admitting you've given up out of fear would be unbearable. Jung explained bluntly, most evils in this world derive from humanity's inability to face their own shadow. When your shadow terrifies you, You seek refuge in any authority that promises to dispel your anguish, even if the price is your inner freedom. But stop a moment. Breathe. Think of all the times you felt that pang of intuition telling you something was wrong. That feeling of discomfort you tried to silence. That inner voice that slowly faded. If you look honestly, you'll see that it was in that silence where your own fragmentation began. The inflated person doesn't destroy your integrity in one blow. They erode it with the slowness of a daily drop falling in the same spot. They convince you that doubt is weakness, that autonomy is rebellion, that independence is a defect you should correct. And you, from fear of the void, accept the deal. The longer you remain there, the harder it becomes to return, because each day you maintain the facade, your mind fabricates new excuses to uphold it. Until one day you look in the mirror and no longer recognize who you are. This is the real damage of the inflated ego. Its ability to invade you without apparent violence, to turn your consciousness into occupied territory, where the only legitimate voice is theirs. If you don't have the courage to reclaim your judgment, you can spend the rest of your life living in that invisible prison, convinced it's a temple. So I tell you with the coldness that truth demands, no voice, no matter how brilliant, deserves the sacrifice of your thought. No external conviction is worth as much as your right to doubt. Because the day you surrender your skepticism, you hand over the key to your mind to the most dangerous predator that exists, the absolute certainty of another. Now that you've seen this uncomfortable portrait, I want you to pause. Look around. Think about the conversations you've had this week. Remember the gestures, the silences, the looks that lasted a second longer than normal. Ask yourself with all the honesty you can muster. How many times did you yield to a voice that didn't respect your conscience? How many times did you swallow your words to avoid disturbing the superficial calm of someone who believes they know everything? Here comes the part almost no one is prepared to accept. When you live too long with someone else's inflation, you end up inheriting its seed, because that toxic certainty, that impermeable conviction, is contagious too. Sometimes, without realizing it, you start reproducing the same pattern with other people. You become inflexible, unable to recognize a mistake, clinging to a narrative where you're always right. That's how the disease works. It moves from victim to carrier without you noticing. This is the darkest legacy of the inflated ego. Its ability to multiply from generation to generation, from relationship to relationship, an invisible chain that transforms you into what you feared most. When that happens, when you discover that the voice that used to crush you now lives in your throat, the question is brutal. What are you going to do with that part of yourself? Because no one emerges clean after spending too much time under the influence of absolute certainty. No one comes out intact from a relationship that devours critical thinking. The wound isn't only what they do to you, the wound is what they teach you to do. That's why, if you've made it this far, I want to tell you something that isn't a self-help phrase, but a reminder you'll have to repeat to yourself every morning. Your judgment is sacred. Your ability to doubt is the last stronghold of your freedom. If you surrender it, you lose everything, even if you keep breathing. Perhaps now you feel a strange vertigo, as if a crack opened beneath your feet. That's okay. That vertigo is the sign that you're not completely asleep yet. That your conscience, although scared, still beats beneath the layers of conformity you've been taught to cultivate. If something I've shared today has moved you inside, if you've felt that uncomfortable pang of recognition, I want to propose a challenge. Don't get distracted. Don't anesthetize yourself with the usual excuses. Tonight, before going to sleep, ask yourself mercilessly, what part of me has been infected by others' arrogance? And what part is ready to recover its voice? Because only when you have the courage to question your own certainties will you begin to be truly free. When you do, When you finally dare to look at yourself without masks, you'll discover something the inflated ego will never be able to steal from you. The dignity of being human, with all your doubts, with all your cracks, with all your imperfect and beautiful capacity to rethink everything. The inflated ego represents one of the most insidious threats to human consciousness, because it operates in the shadows of our deepest psychological needs. It exploits our hunger for certainty, our fear of isolation, and our desperate desire to belong to something greater than ourselves. But true greatness doesn't come from surrendering your mind to another's absolute conviction. It comes from the courage to maintain your capacity for doubt, to preserve your right to question, and to protect the sacred space of your own judgment. Remember that every tyrant, every manipulator, every inflated ego throughout history has counted on one thing: the willingness of good people to surrender their conscience for the promise of belonging. The moment you recognize this pattern, you begin to reclaim your power. The moment you choose doubt over certainty, questions over answers, and independence over the comfort of intellectual submission, you step back into your authentic self. Your mind belongs to you alone, and no external authority, no matter how charismatic or convincing, has the right to occupy that sacred space. If you enjoyed this video, support the channel. Like,